just really quickly, I wanted to kind of give an overview before we allow our experts to talk about the digital divide. And I'll be very frank. I personally came into this conversation significantly late in the game. It was actually at our annual board meeting last June when we had Dr. Santalisas come speak to us to talk about how the school system was making the transition into remote learning and also their plans for summer learning. And we sort of engaged into this larger discussion about connectivity, access to devices. And literally I had trustees who really stood up in a leadership role and said, look, BCF needs to be a part of this larger conversation. Shanae should go find out what's happening and join in and do something about it. What we know is that the conversation had been taking place for months and years before. There was a grassroots organization that had congealed in the months prior to the height of the pandemic, the Baltimore Digital Equity Coalition, of which our guest Jonathan Moore is a part. And we now partially fund their manager. There are foundations like the Able Foundation and the Deutsch Foundation that had long studied this issue. Our other guest, Jason, had been a part of an effort to think about smart cities and digital cities 5 years ago. And then we have institutions like the Enoch Pratt Library that were sort of at the forefront of the ways that institutional anchors could address the issue. And BCF, largely due to the leadership of its trustees, said, we really need to leverage our networks and get smarter and engage. So fast forward, by September, BCF had co-convened with the Greater Baltimore Committee and then City Council President Brandon Scott to pull together a small roundtable of about 15 organizations from the civic sector, from the business sector, and from state and local government, including the executive director of what was then the Governor's Office of Rural Broadband, to talk about the state of connectivity, specifically in Baltimore. You're going to learn that there are vast aspects of the digital divide. Connectivity is just one of them. And we can talk about why BCF kind of focused on that, but I don't want to steal too much of the thunder of the other two guests. Since then, BCF has continued to meet with this group, including with the mayor, who has attended every single meeting to talk about ways that we think about connecting those communities that are the most in need of living their lives online. Whether we're making doctor's appointments, having therapy sessions, working, learning, getting our information. I now read all of my news online, or we're just being entertained. There's a whole world, there's a whole backbone that we need to make sure that communities have access to. What I've learned in a short time is that this is a feel-good topic, but it's also incredibly complex. So thankfully, we have people who know a lot more about this than I, two of whom are on the call and a couple of whom are actually joining this call. So we are actually quite lucky that we have the audience that we have today. So, I'm going to give a brief introduction to our speakers and then hand it over to them to kind of talk about the digital divide globally, but also to talk about what it means in Baltimore and the prospects for bridging it in the near term. So first is Jason Hardebeck, who grew up in the Western United States. He moved between Montana and Nevada several times before arriving to Annapolis to attend the Naval Academy. While in midshipman, Jason met a charming young woman from Baltimore. Oh, this is personal. I'm reading this. This is fantastic. And didn't realize at the time that he was destined the rest of his life to be a Baltimorean. Can I just say as a side note, I've got that story, like a similar story too. You marry people from Baltimore and they have to live in Baltimore. I don't understand it. Although it's a great city, but they have to live in Baltimore. But when you're not from there, you don't really understand like what's the big deal. After his military service, he worked for several local companies and founded an internet software company, which he sold to Facebook in 2011. Along the way, Jason has served as Maryland's first entrepreneur in residence, executive director of the Maryland Business Council and the Greater Baltimore Technology Council. He's now Baltimore's first broadband coordinator. He was Baltimore's first broadband coordinator in the mayor's office under then Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake. And he currently serves as the first director of Broadband and Digital Equity under Mayor Scott. He and his wife, Karen, have 2 grown children, a dog and 2 cats, and can walk to Karen's childhood home in under 10 minutes because of Baltimore. Jonathan is our other. Jonathan Moore is the founder and CEO of RowdyOrb.it. Jonathan is the evolution of what he calls blue collar grit. He believes in change from the bottom up. He helps to nurture and cultivate the human good as a community asset. From college dropout to working in the mailroom of a Baltimore City advertising agency to becoming a print and mixed media award-winning copywriter working with noble brands such as Pontiac and AAA, Nine West, and others, Jonathan then pivoted to become a serial entrepreneur, culminating in his work today on the digital transformation within under-resourced communities specifically. He leverages technology to jumpstart the workforce, and he ensures self-sustainability and community revitalization from the ground up. So I want to thank you both for being here. I'm going to ask first Jonathan to give his presentation, and then we will hear from, first we will hear from Jason, and then we will hear from Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanisha. Good morning, everyone. Senator Mikulski, pleasure to see you all on the call. And I appreciate the opportunity to come in and speak, even if it's virtually. So I wanted to just cover some of the basics around the digital divide, which is a term I'm sure everybody has heard. It has a couple different connotations to it. So I thought I would just kind of address that. And I won't belabor the point. I think Shanisha, excuse me, done a great job of kind of introducing. This is my second time in City Hall, and the real difference now is that there's a significant focus on equity, and particularly digital equity as it relates to my duties. So Alexis, next slide, please. So what is the digital divide? The simplest way to think about this is it's really the difference between those who can make full use of technology and those who are not able to. It oftentimes gets conflated with access to high-speed internet, and clearly high-speed internet is a key part of that, but it's not the only requirement. I should also point out that the way that the FCC and the federal government view access to broadband is what we kind of consider synonymous with internet access, but there's an FCC definition of what the minimum speed requirements are for broadband, excuse me. And it tends to be much lower than what the normal use is. So it's not a very accurate or quality definition of broadband, because meeting the minimum does not actually serve the needs of most people who need access. Excuse me. The other aspect I want to point out is that affordability is not considered when you consider access, when you consider being served by that access. So for example, Baltimore City is viewed as being 100% served because Comcast says that they can serve 100% of the addresses. We know reality is that there are significant challenges and gaps in that connectivity. Affordability plays a huge role in that. There are 2 other components when we talk about digital divide. One is devices, the ability to actually use the internet. So a computer, a laptop, tablet, a smartphone are all considered devices. But another key to that is that having up-to-date modern technology is really key. As we all know, technology advances so quickly, you can easily be left behind if you are not able to afford or access modern devices. And then the third piece, and this is usually the most challenging to address because it encompasses a lot of different factors, but adoption. It's not enough just to have internet access and a computer. You have to know how to use it. So there's a skills piece, there's training, and then actually an understanding of why and how you use the internet. As we know, and clearly this is a perfect example. The world moved online in for a large part of the population over the last 15 months or so. And for the folks that were already in the, on the near side of the digital divide, it was not as major of a push it is for people who are actually being left behind even further now, because they don't have, whether it's the device or the access or the need or the opportunity, whether it's working remotely or not. So adoption is a piece that we really talk about from a digital literacy standpoint. It's not just enough, as I said, to have a device. You need to know how to use it. Next slide, please. So my office, the Office of Broadband and Digital Equity, was created by Mayor Scott's administration to really to tackle the digital divide in a very proactive and permanent manner. And I'll talk about that a little bit and what we're looking at. But I first want to point out that digital divide is not anything really new. It's simply yet another structural inequity, right? So when you map those individuals that have the greatest challenges, it looks very similar to every other map of Baltimore, whether you're talking about safety, food deserts, public health, et cetera, right? It's really an affordability, or excuse me, it's a structural inequity. And we need to treat it as such, right? And that my final bullet point on this slide is that I think what's really different now, not just with this administration, but across the country, is we're starting to view internet access as critical public infrastructure. It is no longer a luxury item. It is something that is really key to success in a modern civil society. Next slide, please. So I've just summarized two of the primary goals of this office. And one is, as it pertains to Baltimore, increasing the availability of reliable and affordable internet access. We can talk a little bit about what our efforts around that will be. And the second is to actually increase adoption. And we're doing it as strategically as possible by really addressing kind of two areas. One is focusing on the end uses of that need. And what I mean by that is, Baltimore City has a number of agencies and other access to our constituents, to our citizens. And the thought is, if we can concentrate on those individuals that we're already serving, whether it's housing insecure, minority affairs, children, youth, focusing on where we already have touch points, and ensuring that digital literacy and access are kind of baked into how we interact with our citizens, that will go a long ways towards starting to address those inequities. The second is what I call amplifying existing efforts. Jonathan's a good example of that, which we get the chance to hear from him in a couple of minutes. And by that, I mean, what can we as a city do to help support and invest in existing efforts, be they broadband infrastructure related projects or efforts to support digital literacy or other aspects of the digital divide. And I think that's where I look at what we have as a city and the resources we have as these are potential assets that can be invested in supporting not just our own efforts as a city, but others' efforts as well. So, and as Shanish just pointed out, there's been a number of efforts over the last year specifically to start to address this in more of a collaborative fashion, the Digital Equity Coalition being one. And that's something that I think we as a city can start to really support in a broader manner, all of these efforts. Because in order to be sustainable, we do need to move beyond kind of this. A lot of it's volunteer. A lot of it is to what we're talking about today. It's there's some initial funding or support that's been given, but we're still developing the muscle memory and the resource necessary to take these efforts forward into the future. And I just want to put this out, what I call our digital North Star. The real goal ultimately is to build a fiber optic network that connects to every address. And so think about this the same way you would think about water, electricity. It's a public utility. This goes beyond the internet, but for the purpose of this discussion, this is really what every modern city needs to be thinking about. How do I build a municipal fiber network that connects to every address. 100 years ago, give or take, we were having these conversations about whether electricity or clean water was important to connect to every house. And I think we've answered that question. I see this as the same question. In 5 to 10 years, this will be a given. The question is just how do we do that? Baltimore happens to have a number of assets that have put us farther ahead in that effort. But there's still quite a bit of time between, quite a bit to go between here and now. And I think in the following questions, we can talk about that in more detail. So that's all I have.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Moore.
Yes.
We're ready for you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for having me today. It's great following Jason. I've known Jason for a while now, and I have no problems following him whatsoever. My name is, of course, Jonathan Moore, and what we're going to discuss today is how we're using technology to really dispel the divide and think about community ownership a little bit differently. And that's what RowdyOrb is really truly bent on as a reformed advertising geek, and now thrust into technology and Wi-Fi technology. I take great pride in what we're accomplishing. Next slide, please. And so back in August of 2020, the American Journal of Public Health discuss how broadband internet access is a social determinant of health. And we're seeing that and witnessing it right now. And I think that when we start to look at broadband infrastructure and internet access, we should think about this painting a much larger picture, but starting in public health. Next slide, please. The one before this one. Oh. So, okay, so let me see. So what we've done, we've decided to create free Wi-Fi hotspots all over Baltimore City. We're at 8 right now that serve over 6,200 people a month. And these Wi-Fi hotspots are located in areas, community resource centers, where they serve food, diapers, and resources, because these are really safe spaces within the community. And we put these deliberately in areas where we knew these were going to be resources and people were going to go, because we wanted to really start to understand how community moves, but to also account for the individuals who don't have a fixed address. And when I say not have a fixed address, those individuals who are squatting in communities, but also who are homeless in those communities, because even though they're not accounted for, they're still members within that neighborhood. And so we said, how do we stretch Wi-Fi over? How do we make it more useful? How do we make it more deliberate? How do we make sure people are going to use it outside of just when you're standing in line getting food and resources, that people are going to use this as a really a great asset? Next slide, please. So the one thing that we're doing is at every free Wi-Fi hotspot, we're putting up an air quality sensor. The beauty about putting up an air quality sensor is that the goal is to train local residents to be able to extrapolate that data and become community scientists. So we're going to have to actually train people to become data and community scientists, leveraging Wi-Fi technology to measure the air quality that's in their community. And so when you start to look at neighborhoods such as Penn North, which Baltimore Community Foundation has provided us funds to build out, we can actually put 6 free Wi-Fi hotspots within Penn North. And all over Penn North, that'd be 6 air quality sensors that's constantly regulating the air quality, measuring the air quality 24/7. And so, next slide, please. And so we said, how do we take this one step further? And so what we've done, we've just created an app. And what this app is only available on Android right now, but it demonstrates when people go into a free Wi-Fi hotspot. Now, when they have this app on their phone, a notification will come up and talk to them about, let them know what resources are in their neighborhood. Can you play, please? I have a short video to share with you.
Access to the internet keeps us all connected. So I think it's needless to say, having no coverage is never fun. It can leave you feeling isolated and alone. But what if there was a way we can all be connected? By simply walking to a Rowdy Orbit free Wi-Fi hotspot, you'd receive an in-app notification letting you know that you are now within a Wi-Fi coverage zone. And what if this app could also help you find access to resources that you deserve? Based on your location, you get a notification of just that. An app that connects you to housing accommodations, workforce development, and food pantries. The Rowdy Orbit app gives you the ability to better enhance your quality of life.
So what we wanted to do was to make sure that
Access
anything that we provide in community, when we start to look at neighborhoods, will start to really push a level of sovereignty. Because instead of taking from the community, how do we continue to pour back into community? How do we use this as an opportunity to really dissuade, well, remove disparities, but also interject new language that is technologically proficient to really allow community to really start to own the narrative. And so our North Star, next slide, please. Our North Star is really focused on exiting to community. So over the next 5 to 7 years, our goal is to really focus on how do we build out local worker-owned cooperatives. So our job really is to just figure this out, to build it, raise the funds, drive the revenue, and then turn this over to local work-owned cooperatives that we're going to build out with community in itself. And those individuals who may not want to work for a work-owned cooperative or partake in community ownership, we're making sure they get certifications over the next three to 4 years so we can onboard them into other industries. And right now, like we're talking to data centers as well as to larger cabling companies that have a larger aging pool. Next slide, please. And we see this as a huge opportunity to really start to tackle aspects of the social determinants of health. And so this really guides our principles in what we do on how do we tackle economic stability, not within the home, but also in the community, access to quality education. When we're training individuals, there's a level of language that they have to be able to obtain on using RF technology, but also making sure that everything we do is rooted in science. So there's a high level of STEM in this. But also tap into the social and community context that exists. Because when we're hiring local residents, usually they're probably second or third generation in their community. And so now they become a feedback loop. So when we disseminate information that we want the community to be able to obtain and absorb, they have someone that comes from a trusted source. And so we use these things along with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so we're thinking about this from a global level, but how do we execute this on a local level? And that's it. Thank you.